I'm Beinn Irbhinn, and I am the voice of the Scottish Socialist Party in Inverclyde. As you'll all know by now, New Labour no longer have a majority on Inverclyde Council, following Vaughan Jones' well-publicised decision to quit New Labour, following her decision to vote yes in the independence referendum. We've spoke about the particulars of this on previous episodes of the show, so I won't cover old ground. I will say, however, that I continue to be amazed by just how poorly run the New Labour group is in Inverclyde. Vaughan Jones was far from the only New Labour politician in the country to announce that she would vote yes, but nowhere else has such an announcement had such ramifications. Elsewhere, after a wee bit of publicity, things seem to have gone back to business as usual. But the total ineptitude of the New Labour leadership in Inverclyde saw this incident spiral out of control, to the point that New Labour lost their very slim majority on the local council. As if this in itself wasn't enough to show that the New Labour group and Councillor McCabe are totally unsuitable for leadership, they've compounded their ineptitude by siding with the solitary local Tory. A key outside body, Riverside Inverclyde's board membership, was recently discussed in the wake of the Vaughan Jones affair. Despite the Tories having only one councillor in Inverclyde, and despite the fact that the SNP are the largest minority group, I think any reasonable person would have been bitterly disappointed that New Labour voted to have the solitary Tory join them on the board instead of the SNP. New Labour and the Tories voting together again, which begs the question, what exactly is New Labour for? This is a party that was set up to represent the workers' interests, but yet again they are voting in line with the bosses and millionaires. Is anyone surprised that the polls are beginning to predict that New Labour will be wiped out in Scotland? The latest polls even have them below the Tories, and we all know how deeply unpopular the Tories are here. So if New Labour can't be trusted to represent the workers anymore, then who can? That's where the Scottish Socialist Party comes in. While New Labour politicians are living the high life by claiming expenses from the public purse, SSP activists are out on the streets campaigning for the powers to improve the lives of working people. One such campaign, which we have been fighting for a while now, is a campaign to tackle fuel poverty. Fuel poverty is defined as paying 10% or more of your household income on heating and lighting, or in other words, 10% or more of your income on your gas and electric bills. Now 10% might not sound like that much at first, but when you take into account all your other household bills, such as your rent or your mortgage, your council tax, your food, your transport, your telephone, your childcare, your clothes, your insurance, your debt repayments, and so on, it soon becomes apparent that 10% of your income is a rather significant amount. In Inverclyde alone, there are roughly 8,000 households in fuel poverty. A recent study, which actually appeared on the front page of the Tory-friendly Daily Express, found that 84% of Scottish households ration their energy usage during the winter as they can't afford the bills. 84% of us in an energy-rich nation. That is simply not good enough, and it is about time the politicians did something about it. The big energy companies make obscene profits every year, and yet they continue to put our bills up. People have had enough of being ripped off. At the Scottish Socialist Party, we want to see the energy industry returned to public ownership to ensure the needs of the people come before the greed of shareholders. That is the essence of socialism, arranging our society and industries so that everyone benefits, not just the rich. Now, of course, any time we speak about nationalising industry, there are those who repeat the line that we need private companies. They claim that private investment is what makes our economy work, and that we shouldn't use government to interfere with the markets in an attempt to solve our nation's problems. One of the fundamental beliefs held by that sort of person is that if we leave the markets alone and unregulated, then the markets will correct themselves and everything will be fine. Despite literally centuries worth of evidence to the contrary, many people still accept this faith in private markets unquestioningly. The ideological universe that these people inhabit is one that has been removed from the social context of the real world. History records that in the 1840s, when it was becoming apparent that Ireland was facing a famine, a delegation from Ireland visited the Prime Minister of the day, Lord John Russell, to plead for relief for the starving poor people. Russell answered their pleas by reading to them from Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, to explain to them that the markets would solve everything and that the government shouldn't interfere. As a result, over 1 million people starved to death in Ireland. In effect, over 1 million people starved to death because of the capitalists' economic ideology. Fast forward to today, and we see the same dangerous ideology still claiming millions of lives annually. Poor people sacrificed at the altar of capitalism. Last year, that included 31,000 UK pensioners who died of preventable cold-related illnesses, and all because they couldn't afford to keep their heating on during the winter. Meanwhile, the profits of the biggest 6 energy companies rose by 77%. At the Scottish Socialist Party, we demand that the profiteering be taken out of this vital industry. We should be cutting prices and profits, not people's lives. Frankie Boyle was onto something when he noted that to certain people, capitalism is a religion. Acolytes believe in its principles, even when these are proved wrong. As Frankie says, business people, in case you haven't noticed, dress in costume, go off on retreats together, and speak with the same glassy-eyed passion about their orthodoxy as Christians. In their world, the market is our God. It's everywhere. When the market is angry, sacrifices have to be made. Go to your nearest scheme, look at the lives of the kids there, and tell me that the market doesn't demand child sacrifices. Frankie goes on to wonder what kind of God the capitalist's market actually is. Clearly a God that thinks you shouldn't receive medical treatment unless you can afford it. That tells us patent profits in the developing world are more important than affordable medicines. It will be interesting to see how their God fares against the Chinese. The Soviet Union was bought off with promises of jeans and cars and cheap stereos. It will be difficult to sell the same mirage to China because they already make all that stuff. The amazing achievement, if you can even call it an achievement, by the current government is to have laid the blame for the financial collapse on people claiming benefits for invalidity, the unemployed and single parent families. So let's reject this capitalist notion of free markets. The weight of evidence collected over the centuries is evidence enough that we should. That millions are starving to death while food literally rots in the fields is simply indefensible. It is interesting how famine deaths become mass murder only when they occur in a Communist Party-led state. If we use the same criteria that are used to tally up the astronomical death counts attributed to the USSR and to China, the British Empire is responsible for nearly 50 million deaths in India alone as a result of the famines in the 1870s and 1890s. In fact, in that case, there is far more convincing evidence that the deaths were intentional. The historian Mike Davis documents that at the height of the famine, grain was being exported for profit outside India, and that foreign observers witnessed British troops massacre starving mobs as they tried to storm the grain silos. It always galls me how anti-socialists are always going on about the so-called mass murder of starvation in communist countries like the Soviet Union and China. Meanwhile, in the capitalist world, tens of thousands of people are starving to death every single day, even though there is enough food to feed the entire world human population twice over. The famines in the Soviet Union and in China were caused by there simply not being enough food to distribute. The constant hunger under capitalism persists even when there is plenty of food. During the famines in Africa a few years ago, the countries there continued to export food for profit. Hunger in capitalism exists by design. It is a logical consequence of the capitalist mode of distribution according to profit for the owners rather than human need. If you ever mention the USSR, these capitalists will say something like, the evil commies starved their own people. But you'll never hear them say the same thing about Ethiopia or the Congo or any other country where hunger and starvation are a fact of life under capitalism. If communists are murderers because they couldn't wave a magic wand and distribute food that didn't exist, then capitalists are far worse murderers because they deliberately withhold food and only distribute it according to their own gain, no matter how many people are starving. Of course, these people will say that socialism doesn't work and that history somehow proves this. They claim, as if it were fact, that every country that ever tried socialism failed. First of all, even if that were true, it still wouldn't justify the suffering that capitalism causes around the world. But more importantly, it is demonstrably false. Before NATO, led by the USA, went in and totally destroyed their country, the Yugoslavs were leading the way in terms of successful socialism. In the 2 decades before the crimes committed by NATO, Yugoslavia had an average annual GDP growth of 6.1%, a decent standard of living, free medical care and free education. Everyone had a guaranteed right to a job. There was affordable government-owned transport, housing and utilities. The literacy rate was over 90% and the life expectancy was 72. They achieved all this by implementing their own model of socialism, a mix of public ownership, private investment and workers' cooperatives, all of which contributed to give Yugoslavia a higher rate of growth than most Western European nations. So let's just forget that lazy argument that socialism doesn't work. So let us implement a socialist solution to the problem of fuel poverty. Let us reject as immoral the government's own solution that people who can't afford their heating bills should just put on more clothes or go to bed early. That sort of attitude by the Tories is demeaning and disgusting. Worse still, it deprives those suffering from fuel poverty from enjoying a true freedom. Freedom in the socialist tradition is understood as man's power over circumstances, freedom from exploitation and oppression of man by man. Freedom requires overcoming abject dependence, poverty and fear. The exploitation of the masses by the big energy companies through artificially high fuel bills in order to produce astronomical profits is one of the biggest threats to the working class today. The current Westminster and Holyrood administrations simply are not doing enough to tackle this problem. In the event of an independent Scotland, the Scottish Socialist Party will campaign to bring North Sea oil and other energy generating industries into the public sector so that we can eliminate fuel poverty as well as invest in protection of the environment and developing renewable energy. Under devolution, the SSP is committed to campaigning for responsibility for energy to be transferred from Westminster to the Scottish Parliament and for the wealth of Scottish energy resources to be brought into public ownership. This will allow us to put people and the planet before profit. On a related subject, the Scottish Socialist Party also demands an end to the imposition of prepayment meters on households where debt is owed to gas and electricity companies. These meters are scandalous for various reasons. For a start, households on these meters are charged the highest tariffs for their energy. Bear in mind that people in debt to the energy companies will generally be those who can't afford the bills, and these companies respond to this by forcing these households onto the most expensive tariffs. One of our party's policies is to force energy companies to issue refunds backdated 5 years to households which have been forced to pay the higher charges associated with prepayment meters. Another problem with these meters is that you basically cut yourself off. If you don't keep your meter topped up, your power goes off. We believe that people automatically have the right to keep themselves warm during the winter. Prepayment meters deny them this right. People who are struggling with fuel poverty need help, and they need to understand that it isn't their fault. Fuel poverty is the fault of a systemic failure of the energy industry and of a government who have failed to act as necessary. Fuel poverty is developing into a political crisis in Scotland, and it is not unlike the one we faced in the late 80s with the poll tax. In that instance, the Tories introduced a highly regressive tax, one which bore no relation to a person's ability to pay. And just like today's fuel bills, they demanded people paid when they didn't have the money to do so. In the end, the poll tax was abolished because 14 million people refused to pay it. There are many important lessons to be learned from the anti-poll tax struggle in terms of fighting fuel poverty. Most importantly is to realise that opposition to injustice is right and proper. But the other is to realise that the opposition didn't happen by accident, and it didn't win by accident. The leaders of the anti-poll tax movement in Scotland went on to found the Scottish Socialist Party. So if you, like us, feel a sense of indignation at injustices like fuel poverty, perhaps you will find a home in the Scottish Socialist Party. Let me take this opportunity to invite you along to one of our meetings. You will be warmly welcomed. On Tuesday the 28th of October, we will be meeting at 7:30 p.m. at 7.5 John Wood Street in Port Glasgow Town Centre. I will be speaking that evening, and my topic will be an introduction to the SSP. The party has picked up over 2,000 new members since the referendum, including many here in Inverclyde. With these new comrades in mind, I will be discussing the history, philosophy and key policies of the Scottish Socialist Party. If you want to find out more about us, then this would be an ideal opportunity. 2 weeks after that, on the 11th of November, same time, same venue, we will be having another meeting. This time, Richie Venton, a well-known face in Scottish politics, will be speaking about the socialist case for Scottish independence. Again, you will be more than welcome to attend. And before I go, if there are any issues to which you would like to hear the SSP's response, please get in touch with us either via inverclyderadio.scot or via the Inverclyde SSP Facebook page. I've been Beinn Irbhinn. Until next time, power and peace for the people.